The winter of 1883 crashed down on Gallatin Valley, Montana Territory, fast and sharp as a blade. Winds from Canada swept through the valley at over 50 miles an hour, whipping across the dry, cold ground before plunging straight into the basin, where North Willow Ridge perched precariously between two low mountain ranges. Here, the cold air did not drift away as it did elsewhere. It pooled, trapped by the deep concave terrain and the thick snowpack compacted feet deep since October. At night, temperatures plummeted to 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and every cabin in the valley felt besieged by an invisible beast gnawing at every plank, every crack, every breath. In that setting, the widow Evelyn Hartwell, 36 years old, lived with her two young children in a cabin her husband had built to the territorial standard before he died. But the standard of eastern forests was no standard for Gallatin Valley. Gusts barreling through the valley made Evelyn's entire cabin tremble slightly. Drafts crept up from the floor like cold ropes wrapping around ankles. The chinking between the logs flaked off in patches whenever wind pressure shifted. She burned 3 cords of wood in just the first few weeks of winter. Yet the cabin remained so cold that breath fogged white even in the kitchen. Each morning, the water bucket in the corner froze solid. Yesterday's freshly baked bread turned rock hard overnight. The two children coughed incessantly, their coughs blending with the wind, howling through the eaves like winter's repeated warning. Not enough. But that scene was not confined to Evelyn's cabin. All of Willow Ridge shared the same desperation. The McGreevy cabin had winds so strong that stove ashes blew back into the bedroom. The Olson family stuffed straw into floor cracks every night to stop heat loss. Firewood in the valley disappeared so quickly that merchants in Bozeman joked that this year the locals would burn their dining tables before February arrived. Amid all that chaos, Evelyn carried an extra burden no man in the area had to bear: the right to be believed. In late 19th century Montana, widows were rarely considered knowledgeable about cabins, rarely trusted to fix drafts, and certainly not seen as capable of inventing anything new. They were expected to endure winter, not confront it. But 1883 was no ordinary winter. The Helena Weekly Herald called it the winter of the decade, a cold snap that weather stations at Fort Ellis recorded as the most severe in 12 years, accompanied by north winds that could pierce any cabin not properly prepared. People told one another that if this winter dragged on, the weakest homes would die before the livestock. For Evelyn, that meant one stark truth. If she did not find a way to keep her cabin warm, no one else would do it for her. And before the big storm hit Gallatin Valley, while the entire valley frantically patched floors, stuffed straw, and built extra walls, one small widow, prepared to face the cruelest winter the region had ever known alone, with an idea no one believed could save anyone. In the days when wind screamed through Gallatin Valley as if trying to rip every log from the cabin walls, Evelyn opened the old wooden trunk where she kept her husband's belongings. Inside, beneath a few worn cloths, she found the small notebook that John Hartwell, the Irish potter, had always carried while alive. Its yellowed pages described apple drying and firewood drying techniques his family had used in County Cork. They channeled air through clay pipes buried deep beneath the floor, letting the airflow pass through naturally warm earth before entering the kiln. That was how ancient drying kilns maintained steady temperatures even when cold sea winds swept across hillside farms. Evelyn read every line and realized something no one else in the valley had ever considered. The ground was the greatest temperature stabilizer they were all ignoring. If air was routed through earth about 6 feet deep, the depth John had noted, then the air entering the cabin would always stay between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter how bitter the wind above ground. 6 feet of earth did not run away. It did not let wind through. It did not shift direction like the drafts in their cabins. It simply held what it had held for ages, the steady warmth of the ground. When Evelyn shared the idea with the men of the valley, she received only laughter. Air needs wind, not dirt, they said, as if that were the only truth of the frontier. The settlement leader shook his head. A buried pipe is a buried mistake. People want air, not mud. Even the old carpenter in the area, known for few words, offered a sarcastic remark. A widow meddling with airflow will only freeze her kids faster. Rumors spread all the way to Bozeman, where merchants at the lumber counter joked, Heard over at Willow Ridge, someone plans to heat a cabin with dirt. But behind the laughter lay a deeper cultural layer, a prejudice Evelyn understood well. Late 19th century, Irish immigrants in America were often seen as heavy laborers, never trusted to bring valuable techniques. Their knowledge was dismissed as primitive, only suited to wet Irish farms, inapplicable to the wide, cold West. Yet Evelyn saw what men accustomed to hammers and axes could not. Earth never betrayed. It held heat better than any wood they scrambled to split. It stopped drafts, unlike log gaps. It needed no tending like a stove. The buried system, if it worked as John described, could stabilize drafts, something every cabin in the valley had failed at year after year. And if drafts vanished, if the cabin no longer had wind ripping up from the floor, Evelyn knew she could keep her children alive through the brutal winter approaching. As the sun set early behind the Bridger Range, the last violet light falling over the frozen valley, Evelyn took a pickaxe and stepped out into the snow. Behind her were the wind, the laughter, and the dismissive headshakes of all Willow Ridge. Before her was the frozen ground, and in John's notebook was her late husband's final reminder: "Let the earth hold the warmth for you." Evelyn chose a strip of land slightly east of the cabin, about 30 feet away, where the ground sloped gently toward a small creek and was open enough for drainage when the thaw came. She drove the pickaxe into Montana's iron-hard soil, a clay hardpan mix compressed by winter until each strike rang like metal on stone. Winds from the Bridger Range poured down, whistling over snowdrifts and flinging icy grit into her face like needles. But Evelyn kept digging, lifting the shovel, laboring to carve a trench 6 feet deep. In Gallatin Valley, early spring was not a season of soft earth. It was when the ground fought every attempt to break it with the full weight of lingering winter. Each time her pickaxe bit in, the soil yielded only small chunks, forcing her to kneel, scrape by hand, dig inch by inch. Passers-by on the trail stopped their horses for a few seconds to watch, then burst out laughing. "Widow Hartwell is digging a pipe to the underworld," one shouted. Another added, half joking, half mocking, "She should fix her stove instead of burying herself in dirt." To them, this was not innovation. It was the desperate act of a woman clinging to any hope before the oncoming winter. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Evelyn went back out, setting an oil lamp at the trench edge, her numb hands still swinging the pickaxe a few more times. Each glance into the dark cabin, where her little daughter coughed in fits, brought fresh urgency. Finish the pipe before the next north wind swept down. By day she dug the trench. By night she made clay pipes. In the small kitchen, Evelyn mixed clay with chopped straw and stove ashes, the rough blend John had used for kilns in Ireland. She pressed portions into her husband's small wooden molds, drying them beside the stove to form simple but sturdy ceramic sections. When dry enough, the sections were joined with thick clay sealant to create a long, even, seamless conduit. But this time, Evelyn did not merely copy the old technique, she improved it. The outer intake was covered with a pine board hood bought from the Bozeman trading post to block direct snow blow-in. Around the hood mouth, she fastened fine metal mesh to keep out field mice and ground squirrels. Along the entire trench length, she maintained a precise 2-degree slope, using a plumb line and a hand-notched stick for groundwater to drain when spring arrived. Her 2 children followed her whenever the wind eased. The older one carried water from the creek. The younger held the lamp over the trench when Evelyn needed to check joints. Sometimes they sat together picking stones, sorting smooth round ones for her to use as pipe bedding. Amid the valley's cold, the sight of a widow digging earth, 2 children hunched beside her, became a spreading story, reinforcing the belief that Evelyn Hartwell had grown so desperate she was clinging to dirt itself. After 2 weeks, the trench was finished, and the final clay pipe sections laid in, resting under thick soil like a hidden vein only Evelyn understood. She backfilled the earth, tamped down the snowpack above, and returned to the cabin. Beneath the kitchen floor, she installed a 2-inch thick wooden air box connected directly to the pipe's end. While the whole valley whispered that the widow had reached the final stage of folly, Evelyn quietly lit the stove and placed her hand near the air inlet. In the silence of a Montana night, amid wind howling against the walls, she heard a sound thin as thread, the gentle movement of earth-tempered air, a calm breath she alone believed was real. Once the pipe lay secure beneath the frozen ground, Evelyn returned to the cabin and began connecting the system exactly as John had written. She placed a 2-inch thick wooden distribution box beneath the kitchen floor, supported on rubble so cookstove heat would not crack the wood. From the air box, she created a small opening using broken fire bricks her husband had once used to repair kilns. Each brick was fitted tightly to give the underground airflow a steady path. Before final installation, Evelyn rechecked the pipe slope with her plumb line exactly 2 degrees as planned, enough to prevent groundwater pooling when the thaw came. Only when everything was in place did she light the stove. Flames spread, cookstove heat pushing air through the 30-foot buried pipe. At first there was only the soft crackle of dry wood. Then moments later she felt something different. A gentle, steady flow appeared in the distribution box. Evelyn held her hand near the opening, a stream of cool but not biting air, somewhere between 38 and 42 degrees Fahrenheit. It was lower than cabin temperature, but not the skin-piercing cold of winds that had blown up from the floor every winter before. That air carried the calm steadiness of deep earth, a mild warmth like stepping into a stone cellar on a summer day. Within 15 minutes, the flow stabilized completely. Evelyn kept her hand there longer, feeling a steady warmth like someone placing a palm on the ground and lending it to the cabin. Changes inside the cabin happened faster than she dared hope. The familiar draft that had swept across ankles from first snowfall to late winter vanished entirely. She tested with a candle placed near the north door. The flame stood straight, unflinching even when she cracked the door. No cabin in Willow Ridge had ever managed that. Temperature rose 4 to 6 degrees in just 1 hour, though she used only half her usual firewood. For a widow who counted every stick for the whole season, that change was enough to choke her up for a moment. The 2 children, long accustomed to cold biting straight into bare legs, now ran around the cabin with visible wonder. Her 7-year-old daughter cried out as if discovering magic. "Mama, the floor doesn't bite my feet anymore." The girl stood still longer than usual, bouncing experimentally, her face glowing. That night, for the first time in weeks, both children slept deeply without huddling like fledglings seeking warmth. But in the valley, hearts remained colder than Evelyn's cabin. When Carter heard about the working underground pipe, he only shrugged. "Just a mild day today. Wait for the real storm." Wright laughed. "Dirt is dirt. It can't warm air. Everyone knows that." The old laughter echoed, casual as if not worth debating. But when night fell, in the flickering cookstove light, Evelyn sat on the wooden chair beside it and saw her breath no longer turn to white fog. For the first time since winter began, the cabin was no longer an enemy trying to drain every bit of warmth from her body. A small sign, but enough to signal that the long battle with winter had cracked open its first ray of light. Yet that joy lasted only a few days before another truth revealed itself, colder than any wind off the Bridger Range. As the sun dipped behind the hills, cabin temperature dropped so fast Evelyn felt as if someone were pulling warmth from every plank. In just 2 hours after sunset, the cabin lost nearly 12 degrees Fahrenheit, even though the underground pipe ran steadily and the earth-tempered airflow remained constant as the first day. This heat loss was not like draft, it was as if the cabin were breathing in a way she could not control. Evelyn sat for hours by the stove, noting each temperature drop. By the end of the 3rd day, she reached a conclusion everyone in Willow Ridge dreaded admitting. The problem was no longer drafts. Airflow was fixed, but the entire thermal envelope of the cabin walls, floor, exterior was failing. She began re-inspecting every log by oil lamplight. When the flame illuminated the walls, Evelyn saw what she had overlooked all this time. The logs had shrunk after repeated freeze-thaw cycles, opening cracks a quarter to half an inch wide enough for wind to slip through even with controlled airflow. The floor rested on low piers, creating an unnoticed crawlspace beneath. When she knelt and pressed her hand to the floorboards, cold rose like a natural vent. It was not her fault. It was the fault of era cabin standards. Standards never designed for cold-trapping basins like Willow Ridge. While she tried temporarily stuffing old rags into wall cracks, a figure stopped at the door. Naya Elkfeather, a crow woman living on the valley's edge who often traded venison and herbs for flour, stood silently watching Evelyn's struggle. Without a word, she stepped forward, set down a bundle of cattails, and gently stopped Evelyn from pushing cloth into the log gaps. "That won't work," she said in a low voice. "Cloth stops wind for 1 day, but earth, She placed her hand on the log wall as if listening to the cabin's breath. Earth must be given back to earth. Nothing holds warmth like earth. In the small kitchen, under flickering lamplight, Naya taught Evelyn the traditional crow-chinking recipe that had helped them survive hundreds of winters on these plains. 60% clay, finely shredded cattail fibers for binding, fine stone dust for strength, and a little wood ash to resist moisture, letting the mix breathe but not allow wind through. Evelyn tested a bit between her fingers, thick, pliable, yet hardening like stone when dry. It doesn't absorb water, Naya said, and it won't crack in spring. It holds warmth better than anything white people use. No one had ever taught Evelyn this, not in cabin guidebooks, not in advice from Willow Ridge men who knew how to build roofs. Only a woman who understood earth knew how to make earth protect a cabin. Evelyn spent 4 straight days rechinking the entire cabin, 49 gaps, large and small, each packed tight with the clay cattail ash mix. The 2 children helped in the way frontier children did, scooping clay, drying cattails by the stove, holding the lamp when wind rose late at night. There was no laughter from the valley now, but neither was there anyone who believed rechinking would make a big difference. Yet 3 nights later, when the first major north wind of the month swept through, Evelyn felt the clear effect. The cabin lost only 6-7 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset, 25 to 30% better than before. Wind pounded the log walls like a loud drum, but no longer pierced the seams. The cabin resonated with a steady, solid hum, as if something had finally been held in, finally protected. Evelyn stood in the dark for a long while, touching the newly dried chinking, feeling the surface warm ever so slightly. And she knew. This was only the second layer of protection. What she had achieved so far was good, but not yet enough against the winter weather stations had warned was once in a decade. The worst was still ahead, but at least now the cabin was no longer against her. It had begun to stand with her. Yet just as the cabin began standing with her, Evelyn recognized an even deeper problem. Not just wind, not just cracks. The entire cabin structure was cycling heat too quickly, like an empty barrel unable to hold warmth. Montana was unlike Maine or Wisconsin. Cold winds here did not merely pass through, but eroded heat, pulling warmth from log walls in minutes. Evelyn remembered the pottery kiln. John had built a kiln that could stay hot all night on one afternoon firing. John had said, "To hold heat long, you need mass. Without mass, fire is just fleeting." That thought struck something she had not yet dared try. The cabin needed added thermal weight, a thermal mass like the kiln, not just pipes or chinking. And that was when Evelyn decided on the third layer of protection one no man in North Willow Ridge had ever considered. She started with the simplest yet most effective gift the Montana prairie offered: sod-thick, grass-rooted earth blocks, naturally bound. Using John's old sod cutter, Evelyn sliced large 18 times 12 times 6-inch blocks, each nearly as heavy as a water bucket. Each lift sent pain shooting through her back, but she continued, because sod was not just dirt. It was insulation and heat battery combined, holding warmth the way wolf dens or bear caves did in winter. After 3 days of work, she lined a 3-foot-high ring along the cabin's interior walls. The sod blocks fitted together like bricks, roots interlacing into a natural cushion. When she pressed her hand against it, the cold feeling nearly vanished. Earth held warmth better than any material she had ever used. But Evelyn did not stop there. She recalled winter evenings in Ireland John had described. Every home had an earth bench, a raised earthen seat near the stove where the whole family warmed themselves. Simple, yet it retained heat for hours after the fire died. She decided to build one in the cabin. Near the cook stove, she piled rubble, tamped clay straw mix, and incorporated broken bricks from John's old kiln foundation to form a dense mass. When finished, the earth bench was high enough to sit on, long enough for a child to sleep on. More importantly, when the stove heated, the bench glowed warm and held heat 6-10 hours after the fire was out. This was heat retention no cabin in the valley possessed. Not stopping there, Evelyn turned to the cook stove itself. Her old stove worked well but wasted heat. She removed remaining fire bricks from John's pottery kiln and assembled them into a fireback, a brick wall placed directly behind the firebox. The fireback absorbed flame heat, then slowly radiated it back into the cabin like a heat mirror. The first test showed 20–30% improved radiant efficiency, achieved with just a few bricks John had once touched. When everything was complete sod lining, earth bench, fireback Evelyn began the real test. In the evening, she fired the stove for 3 hours as usual, then extinguished it to save wood, something she had never dared before. But the cabin did not cool quickly. By midnight, the 2 children slept soundly, breathing steadily, no longer shivering. The floor was no longer icy. The log walls no longer exhaled cold. The earth bench remained warm under her hand. The cabin held heat all night, something unimaginable in North Willow Ridge, where even the strongest men had to rise 3 or 4 times to stoke the fire. With 3 layers of protection, stable airflow from the buried pipe, crow, clay cattail chinking, and thermal mass from sod, earth bench, and fireback, Evelyn had done what no one in the valley thought possible, turned a frail widow's log cabin into a complete heat-retaining core, a survival machine against Montana winter. And still no one believed she could go further. But winter was coming, and it would prove everything. Yet just as the cabin became more stable than ever, disaster signals began arriving from the east, warning that everything Evelyn had built was about to face its harshest test. On the morning of the 3rd of December 1883, the mail rider arrived from Miles City at North Willow Ridge, face pale from cold, hands shaking so badly he could barely open his bag. Inside was a Weather Service telegram. Arctic outbreak, fastest in 12 years. The next line silenced the entire valley. Temperature will drop 45 degrees Fahrenheit in 6 hours. Winds 50–65 miles per hour. Wind chill lethal. People called it the Blue Norther of '83, the phenomenon when the sky turned steel blue before the ground froze solid in hours. Before anyone could prepare mentally, Willow Ridge descended into chaos. Men dragged boards to cover roofs, stuffed straw into floor gaps they had neglected all fall. The smell of dry grass, hammer blows, and crying children filled the valley like a funeral dirge. Settlement leader Carter went door to door, shouting that anyone with small children should come to the church where he claimed it was, at least, not likely to blow away. When he reached Evelyn's cabin, he spoke heavily. "This norther will tear your cabin apart. Bring the kids down into the valley." Evelyn wavered for a moment, but then she looked at the protections she had created, the buried pipe, Naya's chinking, thick sod ring, earth bench warm as the ground's breath. It was no longer the frail cabin where she had once trembled, holding her children. This was a structure built with John's knowledge, her own hands, and all the fear and hope of a mother. "I'll stay," she replied, "and this cabin will stand." That afternoon, as wind began howling over the ridges, Evelyn knelt to check the system one last time like a soldier inspecting weapons before battle. She cleared snow from the pipe hood, ensuring the intake stayed open. She tilted the oil lamp to examine every clay joint for cracks. None. It was work John had never finished on his final kiln, and now she was finishing it for him. Finally, she tested pipe draw by lighting a scrap of paper and holding it near the inlet. The flame bent downward, gently pulled in, airflow steady, and even as deep earth's breathing. No sound was more reassuring in that moment. When she stepped outside for more firewood, the northern sky shifted to copper gray, then darkened to steel blue, the unmistakable sign of a blue norther. A sky color her father had once described. When it appears, everything freezes before you realize it. Evelyn shut the cabin door tight. The storm of the decade was bearing down on Willow Ridge, and everything she had built would be decided in the hours ahead. As the characteristic steel-blue hue of the blue norther began spreading down from northern Montana, North Willow Ridge Valley felt as if it were being pulled into the closing jaws of a storm. The blizzard did not arrive with the rumbling of early-season winds, but struck like a cold, merciless slash. In less than 4 hours, temperatures plummeted from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to -14 degrees Fahrenheit, freezing people's breath the instant it left their mouths. The mountain slopes echoed with wind, howling like a steam train at full speed, slicing through the pocket of cold air trapped in the basin and whipping the thick, compacted snow into white dust clouds that lashed cabins like leather whips. At the Olson home, the wooden roof shook so violently that Mrs. Olson panicked, thinking someone was stomping across it in the night. Window panes rattled as if about to be ripped out by the gusts. The log joints Mr. Olson had proudly claimed were built with 3 generations of experience, now creaked and split into small but razor-sharp cracks. Wind rushed through every gap, extinguishing a test candle in the blink of an eye. In the kitchen corner, the drinking water bucket froze into a cloudy block of ice, its bottom cracking from thermal contraction. Their eyes said what no one dared voice. They could not keep this cabin through the night. The Wright home, which had always believed traditional methods were enough to withstand any northern cold, fared no better. Floorboards vibrated like taut strings, gaps sucking in wind to produce sharp howls, as if the cabin had become an instrument the wind was playing until it shattered. Each time the door opened, the draft surging up from the floor was so strong it blew straight into the children's pant legs, making them cry instantly. Mr. Wright kept the stove burning non-stop until it glowed red-hot, but warmth only rose to the ceiling and vanished. While down on the floor, the thermometer stubbornly stayed at 22 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than outside due to the suction effect. The floor was like a bottomless cold well. The Pearson cabin swayed as wind battered the entire structure off balance. Mrs. Pearson stuffed blankets into wall cracks, but still could not stop drafts powerful enough to shake the bed frame. Her children coughed constantly, each breath visibly clouded with cold. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Tradition, the thing they had taken pride in, was failing completely. Meanwhile, at the far end of the valley, the widow Evelyn Hartwell's cabin remained lit, as if living through a different winter. When gusts ripped through in waves strong enough to uproot the pine in her yard, Evelyn's cabin stood almost motionless, neither shaking nor emitting howls through wall gaps. She placed her hand on the floor, the very thing that had kept her awake many nights, and clearly felt the cold was gone. The airflow from the buried pipe, routed deep through the earth, held steady at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, unaffected by wind, not sucked backward like in other cabins. With the cook stove glowing, the cabin maintained 52-55 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature even settlement leader Carter had never achieved, despite burning twice the wood. Evelyn's 2 children slept peacefully, breathing evenly, without curling up or shivering. One even kicked off the blanket, something no one thought possible on a blue northern night. The earth bench retained stove heat for hours, like a slow but powerful beating heart of soil. The thick sod lining kept warmth from escaping the walls. Crow chinking blocked wind penetration. Everything worked together like a complete survival machine. At the same moment, neighbors throughout the valley struggled in the darkness. A few men, while outside checking roofs, happened to glance toward Evelyn's cabin. They saw smoke from her chimney rising straight up, not whipped down to the ground like from other cabins. They saw the light inside steady, not flickering from gusts. They saw snow lashing the walls, but the cabin not swaying. And most importantly, they heard no draft, the familiar, terrifying sound every valley cabin made on nights like this. They stood there, faces stung by biting wind, staring at the home of the woman the entire valley had once mocked and could not explain it. Some muttered that her cabin had gotten lucky. Others said the wind had spared it by chance. But deep down, all knew. It was not luck. It was something they did not yet understand. As the blue norther continued ravaging North Willow Ridge through the night, many could not sleep, not just from cold, but because they began to feel a strange fear. Evelyn's cabin might be the only place in the valley that truly understood how severe this winter was. And from that night on, each morning when opening their doors, before checking coops or firewood, people looked toward the Hartwell widow's cabin to see if it was still standing. And every morning they saw something harder to believe than the storm itself. That cabin remained peaceful, as if winter were only wind telling stories. The first blue norther had left all of Willow Ridge reeling, but the second was the blow no cabin in the area could withstand. It arrived just 3 days after the first storm withdrew, while residents still had not gathered enough firewood, repaired roofs, or understood why that woman's cabin remained standing. At the faint dawn light over the Bridger Range, northern clouds rolled into long streaks like ink dragged by wind. Then the entire sky poured down a thick gray. Winds from Canada slammed into the valley at 70 miles per hour. So fierce their howling made people think the mountains were cracking open. Snow columns whirled upward in spirals like white ghosts, blocking all visibility. In less than 4 hours, amid wind roaring like thunder, 2 cabins on the valley edge had their roofs torn off. One roof was ripped from its frame, spun in the air, then vanished into the white haze. The Pearson family, with 3 small children, panicked and ran to the cattle barn because it was the only place still holding animal body heat. Cries were swallowed by wind, leaving only the harsh echoes of wood crashing against rock. After 24 hours, Willow Ridge revealed its exhausted face. Men who had believed traditional techniques would save them now realized they had completely underestimated the Blue Norther's power. The Olson family was among the first to collapse. The previous storm had consumed nearly all the firewood they had gathered over summer. By the 4th day of the second storm, they ran out, forced to burn fencing and leftover timbers from an old chicken coop. Mrs. Olson tried sealing vents with wool blankets, but drafts still blew up from the floor so strongly her legs went numb. The Wright home, once proud that men in this family have never feared northern winds, fell into deeper despair. After burning all firewood, they started on tables and chairs, then the kitchen shelf Mr. Wright had hand-built over 2 weeks. His face darkened with every crackle of burning wood. It was the sound of helplessness, of a man defeated by something he had dismissed. The Frost family faced the worst danger. Wind surging from the floor was so intense the 4-year-old boy's fingers turned purple. Mrs. Frost broke down crying, clutching her child. But body warmth was not enough against the flesh-cutting cold flooding the cabin like rushing water. They knew if they did not find shelter, the boy could lose fingers or worse. Only then did thoughts of Evelyn Hartwell's cabin, the one they had mocked, begin entering many minds. They did not want to admit it. But the cold left no room for pride. On the second night of the storm, amid wind howling long like a wild beast's roar, 3 figures appeared at Evelyn's door. They did not knock with usual strength, but with weak, trembling taps as if a few minutes' delay would drop them on her porch. Evelyn opened immediately. One carried a blanket frozen stiff as stone. Another shook so badly he could not speak. The third was Mrs. Frost, clutching her purple-fingered child to her chest. Please, that single word was enough for Evelyn to understand everything. But minutes later, more footsteps sounded. Then wind mixed with pleas for help. When Evelyn opened again, 11 more people stood there, wind whipping their faces, frost coating eyebrows white, wool scarves frozen into hard clumps. No one clung to frontier pride anymore. They only wanted to survive. And Evelyn did not hesitate. She swung the door wide, letting warmth spill out like a welcome, pulling each person inside, wrapping blankets around them, guiding them near the earth bench. When the door closed, an astonishing silence filled the room. Those entering Evelyn's cabin for the first time were utterly stunned. No draft, no wind whistling through walls, no icy floor, no joints popping open. Cabin temperature held at 52-55 degrees Fahrenheit, an almost luxurious warmth on a deadly storm night. Some reached down to the floor, searching for the familiar wind surge from their own homes. But the floor stayed warm thanks to sod lining and earth bench. Others pressed hands to log walls, then pulled back in disbelief. The walls did not exhale cold. Evelyn's children slept soundly, cheeks flushed, as if outside was not the decade's worst storm. The adults looked around, touching everything, afraid to speak. They knew what was before their eyes. The woman they had ridiculed had saved their lives. And then, in the cabin corner near the still warm earth bench, Samuel Wright, the man who had mocked Evelyn the most, who had declared, "A widow can't even burn wood properly," sat silently. He placed his calloused hand on the heat-retaining earth and closed his eyes. Not a word. No excuse. No sigh. In that silence, the entire valley knew. The Blue Norther had changed not just this winter, but how they viewed the woman standing before them. When the second storm finally withdrew from the valley, leaving shattered roofs and barns frozen like stone statues, Willow Ridge entered a phase no previous winter had forced upon them, facing the truth. And that truth began with the meticulous records of the widow they had once mocked. Throughout the Blue Norther days, while her cabin stayed sealed tight and warm enough for children to sleep through the night, Evelyn noted every figure, every small change inside. On the storm's peak day, outdoor temperature fell to -27 degrees Fahrenheit, while milder hours hovered around -15 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, her cabin temperature fluctuated between 53-57 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly as steady as an autumn home. This was a differential no traditional valley cabin had ever achieved. even burning stoves red-hot all night. And what stunned the valley most was firewood use. Across both storms, Evelyn used less than half the amount of other cabins. People had always thought keeping a cabin warm was a battle between man and wood, but Evelyn's data showed otherwise. The issue was not quantity of wood, but how the cabin retained heat. Families Evelyn had sheltered during the storm began recording their own cabin figures for comparison. All were horrified by the differences. The Olson home, despite burning twice the wood, still had drafts surging through the floor so strongly, temperature dropped 15–18 degrees Fahrenheit each night. The Wright home, after burning all furniture, only managed 30–35 degrees Fahrenheit. The Frost home never had a warm floor, even with a glowing stove. Compared to those numbers, Evelyn's cabin retained heat 3 times better while consuming 40–50% less firewood. It was no longer a story of luck. It was data, undeniable truth everyone had to face. Word spread so fast that on the 6th morning after the storm, a county snow sled stopped in front of Evelyn's cabin. 2 officials from Bozeman stepped down, carrying wind gauges, soil thermometers, pressure tubes, and weather maps. They had not come because of rumors. They came because storm reports showed an anomaly. Amid a valley nearly torn apart by wind, one cabin maintained steady temperature, as if it had a natural heating source. They measured wind speed around the cabin. Gusts cut fiercely outside but dropped noticeably near walls thanks to thick sod and the earth bench, creating an air buffer. They placed a thermometer in the buried pipe intake and recorded a steady 41 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of surface wind. They touched the sod and measured balanced moisture, exactly right for retaining heat without rot. When finished, one shook his head and said, what no one in the valley dared voice loudly, a groundbreaking airflow system never documented in Montana. What they saw was a passive, stable heating system independent of wind, fuel-efficient, more effective than contemporary county engineers' designs, and built by a woman using her late husband's pickaxe and knowledge drawn from multiple cultures. That afternoon, as snow stopped and the valley sank into post-storm silence, Samuel Wright, the man who had sneered at Evelyn most, approached her, his voice stripped of all former confidence. He said, I mocked you, but you saved us. The words seemed carried away by wind, yet everyone nearby heard clearly. Settlement leader Carter placed his hand on the sod beside the cabin, as if feeling what had kept his family alive through the storm. He whispered, the earth warmed your home, and your home warmed all of us. No one laughed anymore. No one doubted. For the first time, Valley residents began coming to Evelyn, not to criticize, but to ask her to teach them the system, hoping that before winter hit bottom, they could turn their own cabins into safe havens like the one built by the woman they had once scorned. When that historic winter finally ended, snow melting in patches across fields and the first furrows of soil appearing, Willow Ridge was no longer the Willow Ridge of the year before. Everything in the valley had changed from how people built cabins and retained heat to how they viewed knowledge, pride, and survival on the Montana frontier. It all began with one small woman, hair tied back, hands calloused, who had once sat alone in the cold night recording numbers no one cared about. But exactly 1 year after those storms, 21 valley cabins had adopted the Hartwell subsurface air intake system. To them, digging a 6-foot trench was no longer madness, but the first step to surviving Montana winter. Scenes of digging earth, laying pipe, tamping sod, and applying chinking became common throughout September and October. Children ran around carrying water for fathers. Women dried cattails in late autumn sun. Men, those who had once ridiculed Evelyn, now bent down learning to measure a 2-degree slope with a plumb line exactly as she had. The following winter, results were clear. Each cabin used 30 to 50% less firewood than previous years. Stoves no longer needed to burn red-hot all night. Children who once needed 3 blanket layers to sleep now ran barefoot on warm floors. Frostbite nearly vanished from Willow Ridge, something the county doctor noted in his year-end report as an unbelievable change. From a scorned widow, Evelyn became the person the entire community relied on, not as a symbol, but because her system had completely transformed their lives. News spread beyond the valley faster than the northern winds that had once toppled weak cabins. In mid-spring, The Bulletin of Montana Territory published a long article fully describing Evelyn's techniques: the buried pipe structure, the principle of earth temperature stability, sod lining as natural thermal mass, and the earth bench functioning as a heat battery. For the first time in Montana regional history, a woman's name, not a carpenter's, not an engineer's, not a surveyor's, appeared under Frontier Innovations. The spread did not stop there. Agricultural schools in Idaho, the Dakotas, and Wyoming began contacting Willow Ridge for permission to visit and survey. Students from North Dakota Agricultural College came to Evelyn's cabin to conduct experiments. Wind speed, temperature fluctuation, sod moisture. A group of Idaho students wrote in their report, "We have never seen a cabin operate with such high stable heat without relying on fuel." That fall, when Evelyn went to the creek for water, she saw two men bent over measuring the slope of an air trench near Carter's home. They looked up, smiled, and said, "We read the article about you. We came to learn." Willow Ridge had never had outsiders. Learn from them. But now, they were the place people sought for practical heat science, something no one thought existed here a year earlier. Residents, never much for titles, naturally began calling Evelyn by a name that felt right to all: the widow who listened to the earth. To them, Evelyn had not just heard the earth with her ears, but through her husband's memory, Crow knowledge, the feeling of bare feet on cold floors each winter, and the fear of losing her children, the things that had driven her to persevere. In front of her cabin, residents erected a small pine board sign, letters carved with a knife, rough yet beautiful. She buried a pipe and unearthed a future. No one knew who carved the words, but every person in the valley said they had contributed one knife stroke as a silent thank you. The next winter, when the season's first flakes began falling, the sight in Willow Ridge made any stranger stop and stare. The upgraded cabins all had buried air pipes, thick sod around walls, earth benches glowing like lasting embers when stoves burned. Evenings no longer carried wind whistling through floor gaps, children crying from cold, or wood cracking from contraction. Walking the valley, Evelyn saw smoke rising lightly, straight, evenly sign of warm cabins, moderate fires, no one waking in the night from drafts biting legs. Those who had once sworn only thick logs keep a Montana cabin warm, now admitted. Warmth from deep earth was what had saved their lives. What had once been ridiculed became knowledge passed to the next generation, from father to son, from this valley to other towns. Evelyn stood at her cabin door, watching her two children play in the snow, filled with a feeling hard to describe. Not pride, not victory, but the deep calm of someone who had weathered the storm. Knowing what she left behind was not just a technical system, but the human capacity to listen to nature instead of fighting it. And finally, when survivors of the two Blue Northern seasons retold the story to visiting learners, they always ended with a simple philosophy Evelyn had never spoken, but the entire valley understood. People mock what they fear to understand. But the earth does not laugh, it only holds warmth for those who know how to listen. Thank you for following the story. If you enjoyed it and want to hear more incredible survival journeys, please subscribe to join us. See you in the next videos.